Well, thank you all for coming out in this weather. I'm Susan Call from Politics Prose, and on behalf of our owners and our entire staff, I'd like to welcome you this evening. It's really an honor for me to introduce E.L. Doctorow. He's the author of more than a dozen books. He has a very long list of accolades, including a National Book Award, 3 National Book Critics Circle Awards, 2 PEN/Faulkner Awards, the Edith Wharton Citation for Fiction, and the presidentially conferred National Humanities Medal. He was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize, honoring a writer's lifetime in fiction, and he also won the PEN Saul Bellow Award, given to an author whose scale of achievement over a sustained career places him in the highest rank of American literature. And while there's no award for this, I'd also like to add on a personal note that he's a writer who's just had an enormous influence on me as a reader. I remember picking up Ragtime as a senior in high school, and really for the first time in my experience just being so struck by a passage that I had to put the book down and contemplate for a moment the image of Theodore Dreiser in a Brooklyn apartment trying to find the perfect slant of light that just blew my 17-year-old mind and really introduced me to the magic of literature. So it's really an honor. As you can tell, our format tonight's going to be a little different than usual. We're going to be in conversation. And afterwards, I hope that you'll join us and have some questions as well. I'm going to begin by asking our author to read a brief passage. I'm just going to tell you a very little bit about the book, being very careful not to give away any of the story, because a couple of turns in this narrative really caught me by surprise, so I wouldn't want to spoil that for anyone.
By surprise.
But just the most bare bones description is that this is a conversation between Andrew, who's a kind of hapless, depressed, somewhat paranoid, recently widowed cognitive scientist, and his psychiatrist, or at least that's what appears to be going on, but we'll talk more about that later. So he's going to just read some of the opening passages for us.
And this is right at the beginning. Forgive me. I see your marks there. Oh, I see from the beginning. Oh, someone's doing most of the talking in this book. That's Andrew, and someone is doing most of the listening. That's the fellow he calls Doc. And every once in a while, Andrew stops to think, and in the text is a little parenthetical, italicized word, thinking. I don't quite know how to deliver that in speech, but I can tell you about my friend Andrew. Oh, also he speaks of himself in the third person sometimes. Do any of you do that? Norman Mailer used to do that. I can tell you about my friend Andrew, the cognitive scientist, but it's not pretty. One evening he appeared with an infant in his arms at the door of his ex-wife, Martha, because Bryony, his lovely young wife after Martha, had died. Of what? We'll get to that. I can't do this alone, Andrew said as Martha stared at him from the open doorway. It happened to have been snowing that night, and Martha was transfixed by the soft creature-like snowflakes alighting on Andrew's New York Yankees hat brim. Martha was like that, enwrapped by the peripheral things as if setting them to music. Even in ordinary time, she was slow to respond, looking at you with her large, dark, rolling, protuberant eyes. Then the smile would come, or the nod, or the shake of the head. Meanwhile, the heat from her home drifted through the open door and fogged up Andrew's eyeglasses. He stood there behind his foggy lenses like a blind man in the snowfall, and was without volition when at last she reached out, gently took the swaddled infant from him, stepped back, and closed the door in his face. This was where? Martha lived then in New Rochelle, a suburb of New York, in a neighborhood of large homes of different styles, Tudor, Dutch, colonial, Greek revival, most of them built in the 1920s and 30s, houses set back from the street with tall old Norway maples, the predominant trees. Andrew ran to his car and came back with a baby carrier, a valise, 2 plastic bags filled with baby needs. He banged on the door. Martha, Martha, she is 6 months old. She has a name. She has a birth certificate. I have it here. Open the door, please, Martha. I'm not abandoning my daughter. I just need some help. I need help. The door opened and Martha's husband, a large man, stood there. Put those things down, Andrew, he said. Andrew did as he was told, and Martha's large husband thrust the baby back into his arms. You've always been a fuck-up, Martha's large husband said. I'm sorry your young wife has died, but I expect that she's dead of some stupid mistake on your part. Some untimely negligence, one of your thought experiments, or famous intellectual distractions. But in any event, something to remind us all of that gift you have of leaving disaster in your wake. Andrew put the baby in the baby carrier that lay on the ground, lifted the carrier with the baby, and walked slowly back to his car, nearly losing his balance on the slick path. He fastened a seatbelt around the carrier in the back seat, returned to the house, picked up the plastic bags and the valise, and carried them to the car. When everything was secured, he closed the car door, drew himself up, turned, and found Martha standing there with a shawl around her shoulders. All right, she said, thinking. Go on. No, I'm just thinking of something I read about the pathogenesis of schizophrenia and bipolar disease. The brain biologists are going to get to that with their gene sequencing, finding the variations in the genome, those protein suckers attached to the teleology. They'll give them numbers and letters, snipping away a letter here, adding a number there, and behold, the disease will be no more. So, Doc, you're in trouble with your talk and cure. Don't be too sure. Trust me, you'll be on unemployment. What else can we do as eaters of the fruit of the tree of knowledge but biologize ourselves, expunge the pain, extend the life? You want another eye, say in the back of your head? That can be arranged. Put your rectum in your knee? Not a problem. Even give you wings if you want, though the result would not be flying aloft, but more like giant skips, floating megastrides as on those tracks that are like the flattened escalators moving along the long airport corridors. And how do we know God would not want this, perfecting his fucked up imperfect idea of life as an irremediable condition? We're his backup plan, his fail-safe. God works through Darwin. That's the beginning.
So my first question is, on one level, this is Andrew talking to Doc, but there's also implications that there's something else going on, or that you're being deliberately cryptic about that. And I wonder, is there an actual answer, or do you want the reader to create his or her own interpretation? I'm also going to give you the mic.
Okay. The thing is that after you do this work a while, you want to, you remember what Ezra Pound said. He said, make it new. And eventually you realize how conservative the art of fiction is, while all the other arts have gone through immense transformations over the past 100 years. Certainly art with the Impressionists, and then Picasso and Braque, and then the abstract expressionists and the conceptual artists. Have been enormous changes in art and in music. In Stravinsky, The Rites of Spring, all the way up to Shostakovich, or in popular music, ragtime, jazz, Frank Sinatra, swing, and then doo-wop, and then rock blowing everything away. But fiction has been more or less grounded in the theory of imitating what's out there, imitating the social reality. And while there have been experiments in modernist writers, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, of course, Virginia Woolf, there's this insistence on getting back to the traditional realm of storytelling. So this is going to be a very long answer to your question. But it comes a time with all of us where we want to go a little further, dig a little deeper. And I started thinking this way about 10 years ago with a book called City of God, where I avoided a linear narrative and worked with a series of images that I returned to again and again during the course of the book, and each time a slightly different approach. And to that extent, there's something of that sort in Andrew's narration, that also additionally there's no distinction made between what he might be thinking or imagining and what is real. In other words, that idea that dominates fiction, where you know what's really happening and you're believing what's really happening, and then making a distinction between that and what is only being imagined. So you can't do that in this book. You don't know whether he's thinking about what's in his brain or whether he's describing what actually has been going on in the socially real world. And so that it does mystify some readers. And as I've said before, for this book, more than most, judges the reader. And people have told me that they read it, they finish it and then turn it and then start it all over again, read it twice. So I don't have any objection to that, except they don't buy 2 copies to do that. But what was your question?
Well, is there an answer, or is it just open to it? Do you have an answer?
Well, no, I don't have an answer. This sort of takes the idea of the unreliable narrator well past unreliability. But it seems to me somehow it works. This is always the way you move ahead. You become the instant reader of every line you've written, and if you're on the nerve of the book, you keep going. And if you can't keep going, then you're doing something wrong. You're not listening to the book, not letting it tell you what it has to be. But there have been many interpretations of this book. One is that Doc, the person who's doing most of the listening, is actually a ventriloquist, and Andrew was his dummy. I thought that was pretty neat. And then another one, at a certain point toward the end of the book, Andrew, who's worried about consciousness and its nature, and the relation between the brain and the mind, says to Doc, "Tell me something, am I a computer?" And Doc says, "You're a human being." And Andrew says, "Well, of course you would say that." So the issue that does dominate his thinking is how the brain, that what he calls that 3-pound knitting ball, can produce our consciousness, our feelings, our thoughts, our wishes, our longings, and all the subjective conditions of our lives. How does that happen? Because the original idea of having a soul separate from the body is no longer a reputable idea, according to neuroscientists, and maybe the soul is fiction. So they're called materialists, and the question to them was, well, okay, if it's the brain, if it's only the brain, how does that happen? How does it work so that we become what we think we are? And this issue plagues Andrew. And at one point he says, "How can I think about my brain if it's my brain doing the thinking? I can't trust anyone, least of all myself." And this does touch on a contemporary intellectual problem of great enormity, as the neuroscientists and the philosophers of mind try to struggle with this idea. And there are people who are trying to, in Switzerland, for instance, and he mentions this in the book, who are trying to build an emulation of the brain on the theory that as complex as the brain is, it's finite. And they're going to stretch out all those dendrites and map all the synapses and all the neuronal connections and figure out how that brain becomes the mind. And Andrew is very worried about that as a cognitive scientist, because he says the minute that happens, the minute we make that discovery, then someone will build a computer that has consciousness. And he finds that terrifying. He says, when that happens, all the old stories are finished. The Bible, all these Bronze Age traditional concepts we have of what it means to be human are right out the window, and it's a disaster, he says, equivalent to a meteor hitting the planet and destroying it. On that cheerful note,
well, that's interesting that you project that into the future, because a lot of what Andrew's brooding about are kind of old existential questions, and he in fact invokes Kant and Sartre in thinking about all that. But at the same time, you have a really fantastical element to this story, and I wonder where that comes from. Again, without giving anything away, you have dwarves, you have acrobats, you have a lot of sort of circus elements in here. I wonder where that came from.
not dwarfs, midgets.
Sorry.
Or he calls them diminutives. And you see, among other things, this is a love story. And Andrew falls in love with a young woman in this obscure Western college to which he's fled to get away from Martha and his past with her, and the fact that he has a baby he had with Martha, he is inadvertently killed by giving it the wrong medicine through an eyedropper. So he goes out west and he falls in love with this gymnast, Bryony. And it turns out that her parents are diminutive people who live in California. This book can be described as a series of interlocking images. Why circus imagery is so important? It just happened that way, and it began with an image that he has of a small girl drawing with colored pencils on a pad, and the minute she sees him looking, she takes her pencil and scratches the drawings out. Very good little circus drawings, and it turns out that Bryony's parents are circus performers, and so on. Other sort of images that possess him or states of mind have to do with Mark Twain. He thinks Mark Twain, he's obsessive about Mark Twain, who is the sort of the quintessential American author, the one author in our history who sort of carries the national soul. And so these are the way the book sort of moves from one situation, image to another. And so it's not quite linear, it goes off like this. And there is an ending to the book, which is why I know there would be an enormous sale here in Washington, D.C., because the end of the book takes place in Washington, D.C., and you're all very concerned about what happens here in Washington, D.C.
Well, speaking of the imagery in this book, I thought one of the most powerful images was the mountains. It's you just describe the mountains so beautifully that I was going to ask you to read a passage and maybe talk a little bit about why you drew that in, and why the setting was, where the setting came from in your own life. Let me.
Andrew goes out to takes a job to teach elementary brain science at this Western college, which is in the foot of the Wasatch Mountains. And
Part one, and then there's another.
yeah, he's saying the doc says, "I see, so it turned out to be a good change of scenery for you." And he says, "No, not really. I don't suppose you've ever lived under a mountain. Wasatch has ruled that town. After a day or two, the truth dawned on me. You got up in the morning, they were there. You pulled into a gas station and they were there. They were there in their stolid immensity. And that was that. You were colonized. They negotiated the light. They had to pass on it before it got to you." Oh, I don't understand. They took in the light. They'd bounce it down or suck it up, as was their wont. It was a kind of mountain bureaucracy, and nobody could do anything about it, least of all the sun. The college had a deal for visiting faculty with a local suite motel, Formica countertop kitchenette, laminated furniture, and turquoise and rust curtains to suggest the Native American heritage. That was also what the mountains did, invite a corporate culture. I was the college's half-hearted attempt to expand its offerings. I was the one-man department of brain science. I had no one to talk to. My colleagues, if that's what they were, in their polite and distant way, were bores. I was lonely and miserable. Does he go on?
Page 22, or page 36.
36. What was her background, Doc says, meaning Bryony. Her background, the Wasatch Mountains. No, I mean, you want to know where she was from, the extraordinary child, this extraordinary child who her parents were, the family that produced her? Yes. Why does that matter? They don't tell you in movies where people grew up, unless the movies are about people growing up. They never tell you where your heroes come from, to whom they were related. You just find them as they are in the present moment. You're called to worry about them as they live on the screen, and all you know about them is the time they're there. No history, no past, just them. Is this a movie? This is America. Having discovered each other, we went hiking in the mountains, Bryony and I. You could walk right up the street and find yourself at the foot of a mountain trail. The Wasatch let you know they were always there, even when your back was turned, even as you drove away from them, you sensed them. They changed constantly according to the light they negotiated, but also the temperature, their coloration, like their change of mood. But they were constant presences, a family of gods, low mountain jagged in the peaks, this one taller, that one shorter, but all connected in alliance of venerable powers, trails scarred, implacable with snow that could kill, or carelessly alive with spring foliage in all the pale shades of green or blue evergreen, but still with the yellow-brown remnants of the previous year. And then their tilt, their rising backward to their apex in the sky, as if in aversion to something we supplicants had done to displease them. For when you lived in that town a while, you knew those mountains ruled. They walled you in. You were their people. Oh.
And then a little more broadly, moving away from this book exclusively, this book is steeped in history, as are all of your novels, and yet I've heard it said you wouldn't call yourself a writer of historical fiction. Do you want to speak to that?
You shouldn't have set me off on that track. My position is that I'm not a historical novelist. If you think about it, all books, all novels are set in the past, the far past, the recent past. And it depends on the focus. If it's a wide focus, the novels will include public figures and public events. If it's a narrow focus, say if this is about a personalist novel about a family and sort of autobiographically directed, it's still a historical novel. So either all historical novels are historical or none are. I also pointed out to someone who made the mistake of bringing the subject up that there were very peculiar things. For instance, the fact that Hemingway and André Malraux during the Spanish Civil War wrote about the Spanish Civil War. And they published their books either during the war or just after the war. And that was 79, 80 years ago, so do we call those historical novels? What do you say about Thomas Mann, who wrote a tetralogy about Joseph and his brothers based on a few passages in the Bible? You can't call that an historical novel. At any rate, my books are also set in places out west, down south, the Adirondacks Mountains, New York City. So you might call me a geographical novelist as well as an historical novelist. I like just the word itself without any modulation. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite among your own novels?
No.
And are you working on something now?
I am. Yeah, actually it takes a while to recover from any given book. 6 months to a year, actually, before you get going again. The book casts its spell. You've been working on it for a couple of years at least, and it's hard to let go of it. And I remember doing a reading of a book called The Waterworks at the Brattle Theatre in Cambridge. And I noticed it's a small theater that while I was reading, I was making changes in the text. And there was a fellow who was following along right there in the 6th row. And he was the first to ask a question, of course. He said, "Mr. Doctor, I noticed that what you were reading wasn't quite what's on the page. You were making changes and cuts and adding words. Why did you do that? Because you're still writing the novel, although it's been published, or for the sake of this occasion?" And then everyone leaned forward to see what I was going to say about that. And I said, "This must be Cambridge." Then I got a laugh. So the next reading I did was in Seattle, and some fellow asked this endless question. And I said, "This must be Seattle." "This must be San Francisco. This must be..."
Now everyone will be intimidated. Some reviewers have remarked this book was a departure for you then, talking about writing historical fiction or not writing historical fiction. Did you feel that it was a departure as you wrote?
Well, only in the sense that it was constructed as almost as a monologue. And at one point he says to Doc, when it becomes apparent to him that this is not the ordinary therapeutic situation he's in, or it becomes apparent to us, that he'd always thought of himself and Doc as walking along a road and talking, which means he had in mind Cervantes, Don Quixote, or Jacques the Fatalist, the Diderot's book. So I had that feeling about this, that they weren't really walking, they were just sitting in one place. But that gave me a sense of how to structure the book, that traditional way of having two people going along the road and having adventures.
We'll ask one more follow-up question, then we'll open it up to your questions. But do you know what you're doing when you sit down to write? Do you always have a plan?
No plan. You start with, or I start with an image or something that is very evocative, and I wonder why. With Billy Bathgate, it was an image of men in black ties standing on the deck of a tugboat, and I didn't know, it was such a disparate combination of formal dress and a workboat that I wondered what they were doing there, and that wonder turned into Billy Bathgate. One of the images in this book that started me was the opening scene of Andrew standing at the door in the snow and waiting for wanting the door to open. I knew there was some urgency involved. I knew he was in trouble. That was all I knew. And everything was generated out of that image. So it's not an entirely rational way to work, but never start, no plot, no plan, and sometimes it doesn't work, and you just throw whatever it is away. And in this case, it worked, and it kept going. So you write to find out what you're writing. I know that sounds a little crazy, but that's the way it is. I don't recommend it for everybody.
Do you have a lot of discarded pages?
Yeah. But I'll look at them again someday, see what's there.
Well, open it up to your questions, and would you mind going to the mic right there? Thanks.
Actually, what you just said made me want to follow up a little. I'm not sure if this is on, but
Just lean in a little.
describing a writer's life and thinking about a writer's life, I think about what it's like today for a lot of young writers, and there are lots of them that are very good, and the difficulty for them in carrying out their writing life. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Getting started has always been difficult. The writers who break through are the ones who feed on adversity. The problems today, of course, are all the other distractions of the internet and of endless forms for film to be seen or responded to, and the fact that publishing conglomerates now have in effect limited the number of places that you can place a book with. So these are all problems, and to a certain extent the publishing industry now is subsidized by the universities with their writing programs. In the old days, an editor would put down a little money betting on a writer, and a young unknown writer, and wait 2 or 3 years for that manuscript and hope something would come of it. But now that kind of preliminary work and betting is done in the creative writing programs. So when the editor sees the material, it's been edited by the teacher and the university. That can produce a very good writer, but it also has its dangers. That people will write the way other people write. So it's tough, but it's always been tough. It's tough for everybody. It's tough for musicians. It's tough for artists. But if you have that sense of calling, and if that's what you want to do, you'll press on. I thought it was difficult when I got started, you always have that sense of. I was fortunate to be a reader for a motion picture company, and in those days, westerns were very popular, and I was reading all these really lousy westerns. And I said I could lie about the West better than these people are. And so I stopped what I was doing, and I wrote what I thought was a parody, but it sort of got serious as I went on. And the idea of doing something, working with disreputable materials to making something serious is what finally caught me and got me doing that. But it also had the advantage that a professional editor in a publishing house would feel comfortable with what he thought was a genre, and so would be more likely to buy it than if it just sort of came in totally unlabeled. So I accidentally, that's the way I got my first novel published, called Welcome to Hard Times, which, to my astonishment, has been in print ever since. It was published sometime in the late 19th century.
I would just ask, and maybe I'll just speak loud. When something doesn't work, how painful is that? When you gotta drop that, let go, and move on.
You have to have the courage to admit that something's not working, and the sign is always very small. For instance, you'll be reading along what you've written. Every 50 or 100 pages, you do stop to see where you are. And you notice as you're reading that you tend to skip this particular paragraph because you know the next paragraph is really good. Stop. Why have you skipped this paragraph? What have you done wrong? It's a very small signal. And it turns out that everything after that paragraph has gone way off track. This is what happened to me. Or in the case of the book of Daniel, that I wrote 150 pages of that, and it's a very dramatic situation about a couple accused of spying for the Soviet Union and giving away the atomic bomb secrets, and who are then executed, tried and executed. Very dramatic stuff, and I was bored with what I was writing. And I took those pages and threw them across the room on the theory that I was not a writer. If I could make something like this dull, then I had no business writing. So in anger at my own pretensions as being a writer, I put a piece of paper in the typewriter. That's what we used in those days. And I started to write in the voice of Daniel, the son of this couple. And then the book just flowed. But it took that moment of desperation and admitting that I had done something wrong to get to the point where I wasn't going to narrate this book, but he was, because he was intimate with the facts and the situation without having any true knowledge, which was my situation. I didn't know these people based on the Rosenberg case, of course. So that's the kind of thing you have to expect is going to happen. It's a very noble life if you think about it.
I heard one writer say that she was a writer because she could not write. She just was drawn to it, pulled to it. Just interested in your comments on that.
Oh, well, I don't know if I was ever that conscious. Part of the thing is if you're a kid and you read a lot and you just like to read, everything without any discrimination. If you're a writer, somewhere along the line, you'll be asking two questions. One question is the obvious one: what's going to happen next? The other is, how is this done? Isn't this interesting that I'm reading this story about a dog who turns into a wolf called Call of the Wild, and it's these words on a page, and I'm excited and more in this book and its life than I am in my own. How is this done? So that's a question you may ask yourself. I had the additional advantage of growing up when everything we have now, all the diversions, were not in existence. My parents were not keen on television. They thought it was bad for kids. And so it was mostly radio and reading for me. The other advantage I had was being named after Edgar Allan Poe. You might not think that's an advantage, but that was my father's idea. He liked Poe's work. He liked a lot of bad writers, actually. But Poe is our greatest bad writer. So that was some consolation. The game called Authors, a card game, and he was one of the cards. So I was pretty impressed with that. And so there was some sort of an injunction, parental injunction there that often happens that, I don't know, my father was a dreamer and he gave up whatever dreams he had or philosophical inclinations to support his family through the Depression. So maybe giving a kid a name like that meant something to him. I'm not sure. But I never thought to ask about it till a few years ago before my mother died. He had died long before. And I said to her, did you and Dad ever realize you named me after a alcoholic, drug-addicted, delusional paranoid with strong necrophiliac tendencies? She said, Edgar, that's not funny. But it was an advantage. It was an advantage.
Thank you. What authors and literary movements are exciting you right now?
I like this guy, George Saunders. 10th of December is the book he published a year or so ago. George Saunders is quite remarkable. I like Don DeLillo's work very much. I think he's an amazing writer with a great conceptual understanding of the way the world works. Jennifer Egan is a fine writer too, who wrote that book about the Goon Squad. There are a lot of good writers around now. My feeling is there are more good writers working today than when I came up. So that's very hopeful, I think. Who do you think of?
Right now?
Yeah.
I've been reading some Jeanette Walls. I think that what she's done with her family biography has been very compelling. I'm not sure if you'd call it historical fiction.
Historical fiction, oh. Yeah, David Foster Wallace, the late David Foster Wallace, really kind of a genius, actually.
You mentioned that all writing is pretty much historically based or current based, which kind of ignores fantasy and science fiction. Do those not have any interest for you?
I don't. I don't preclude anything. Someone asked me what would they, how would I surprise them by telling them what I have in my bookshelves or desk? And among the things I named was a couple of mystery writers who I think are really smart and capable. John Sanford and Lee Child. These are genre thriller writers. I don't exclude them. I like to read mysteries when I'm depressed because they always turn out where justice triumphs, which is not the way the world works.
We have time for one more question.
I have a question. I was just wondering about your idea of being inspired by two things. One was places where you feel like you're in some way not a geographical writer, but places inspire you. They're set in fixed locations. And then also this idea of vivid imagery coming to mind. And my question was, what inspires you most? Is it something where you'll have a dream and that's where these visions will come, and then from there it flows, you discover what you're writing? Or is it something where you like to go to certain places? Like
You can never know what it's going to be. So it can be an image, as I discussed. It could be a piece of music. Certainly, ragtime came out of my enjoyment of that form, and or it can be a kind of a presiding rage. Like the Book of Daniel is really about the 50s and what the nation was, the state of mind of the nation was in the 50s, and that got me going. The idea of contrasting the old left of the 30s with the new left of the 60s, and that interested me. The idea of telling the story of your country for over 30 years, but I had no story till I remembered that case of the Rosenberg. So it can be, it just hits you from any direction. You never know, and only you just begin with this need to do something, and then it fixes on an image or piece of music. I think this gentleman who's writing his own novel right there.
That's you. Well, I was curious. You obviously don't put paper and typewriter, I assume, anymore. But could you tell us about your process? Some writers say how systematic they are. Barbara Kingsolver said she sets it up almost as scientific when she spoke here a few months ago. And I'm curious how you approach it, how you write. Do you, in a sense, wait for inspiration, or you?
No, you don't wait. You go to work every day like everyone else. At least I do. And I might sit there for 7 hours when nothing happens, and then in the last hour, something might, or every day will be different. What's important is that you complain a lot to anyone who's around. Am I right about that? There you go. I tell this story of that my wife was on a radio program many years ago, whose talking program. The show was, the theme was living with an author. And my wife was on that, and Rose Styron, Bill Styron's wife, was on it, and Nan Talese, married to Gay Talese, was on it. I forget who else. So the woman running the show began this way. It is often said about novelists that they are egomaniacal brutes with no consideration for anyone around them, complaining all the time, terribly self-involved, and just generally difficult. And before she'd been introduced to the radio audience, my wife said, "Oh, you knew my husband." I was out of town at the time, but I heard about it.
Okay, well, that's a great comic note to end on.